how does a novelist, decades after a tyranny falls, really capture the full horror of it, the complexity?
Yeah, and maybe even more. Can fiction sometimes get closer to the truth, especially traumatic truth, than, say, a straightforward history book?
Exactly. That's the core question we're tackling today.
We're diving into a book that tries to do just that. Mario Vargas Llosa's incredible novel, The Feast of the Goat.
And welcome to a bold new take on book coverage. This is our extended analysis. It's more than just a summary, though we have that too.
Right. We look at how the author builds their argument, how they create influence, and how they earn or maybe sometimes lose your trust as a reader.
We want to give you the tools to read with, well, sharper insight, more discernment.
Thinking about reading this book, this should definitely help you decide. It's also great if you're an aspiring writer, looking at how narratives are built.
Definitely. And hey, if you find this deeper format useful, please let us know. Your feedback really does shape what we do next.
So, the book itself, it zeroes in on the fall of Rafael Trujillo's dictatorship in the Dominican Republic. Decades of rule ending brutally in 1961.
And it's a deep, deep look at trauma, abuses of power, the compromises people had to make.
And the scars that last long, long after the regime itself is gone.
Okay, before we really get into the mechanics of the novel, just a quick note for you listening.
You are experiencing a unique two-host AI conversation. This is powered by Google's NotebookLM, designed for, well, deeper and more dynamic book analysis.
All right, let's start with the basics. Context, credibility.
Okay, so the author, Mario Vargas Llosa. He's a Nobel laureate, a huge name in Peruvian literature.
Right, and he has this long track record of exploring political themes in Latin America. That alone gives him significant weight, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. Huge credibility or ethos right from the start, especially tackling such sensitive, relatively recent history.
And that credibility matters.
Yeah.
The book came out in 2000. That's almost 40 years after Trujillo was assassinated.
That distance is crucial. It allows for reflection, for perspective on that authoritarian past.
And it lets Llosa make a case, implicitly maybe, that fiction is needed to grasp the kind of trauma history sometimes struggles to convey.
Exactly. He's using the novel to really dissect how dictatorships work. Not just the events, but the psychological toll, the moral damage.
So the purpose isn't just telling a story, it's provocation.
I think so. It forces you to confront uncomfortable questions about complicity, resistance, the way tyranny just seeps into everything.
But, okay, dealing with real events, real people, but also inventing thoughts, feelings. How does he maintain intellectual honesty? How does he build trust?
That's where the logical structure, the rigor comes in.
Yes.
His strategy is quite demanding.
How so?
Well, he doesn't paint characters in black and white. Trujillo himself, the assassins, the victims, they're all complex. He doesn't fully demonize or absolve them.
That balance definitely signals intellectual integrity.
Right. But the core technique is how he blends meticulously researched fact with fiction.
That's always the tightrope with historical novels, isn't it? How do you know what's real history and what's narrative invention?
He often signals it through the structure and the viewpoint. The factual spine, the assassination details, the conspirators' names, the regime's known horrors, that's the evidence.
Okay.
Then he layers on top of that his multi-perspective approach. You get the intimate, sometimes fragmented story of a survivor like Urania Cabral decades later.
And then you get the tense political viewpoints of the plotters in 1961.
Exactly. That weaving together provides the historical anchor points alongside really authentic-sounding emotional dialogue. It makes the whole thing persuasive, intellectually solid, even though it jumps around a lot.
So the facts ground it, give it that authority. But you mentioned chaos earlier. If the dictatorship was chaotic, how does the structure make us feel that?
Ah, that's a great point. That's the narrative strategy in action. The syntax of the novel, you could say.
How does that work?
He uses constantly shifting timelines and points of view. It mirrors the uncertainty, the feeling of instability under totalitarianism. We jump between Urania in 1990s New York, confronting her past.
And the frantic final days of Trujillo's regime back in 1961.
It's absolutely a deliberate structural manipulation.
Yeah, our analysis suggested that in the early parts, focusing maybe on the state's machinery, the rhythm feels systematic, almost suffocating cycles of bureaucratic dread.
Showing the control.
But as the assassination plot gets closer, the narrative fragments, it gets more urgent, chaotic.
Precisely. That shift in rhythm mirrors the regime's own implosion. It forces you, the reader, into the character's disorientation. You feel that anxiety because you're never quite sure where you are in time.
And this structural chaos, it feeds directly into the emotional power, the pathos, right?
Yeah,
Llosa is unsparing, the violence, the betrayal.
he really is. You see it so clearly in the suffering of the conspirators after the assassination. The details are brutal. And of course, in Urania's story,
Urania's story feels like the anchor for the long-term trauma. She makes it visible decades later.
she's the pivot, really, showing the consequences, bringing the political horror right into the most private family space.
Something else I noticed was the shift in language, the diction. When he's describing the mechanics of Power Trujillo's health, military stuff, it feels very concrete, almost clinical sometimes.
Yes, that clinical tone helps ground the political facts, maybe objectify the horror a bit.
But then,
But then, when he delves into Urania's buried memories or the conspirators' inner turmoil, the prose changes completely, becomes more lyrical or fragmented, sometimes almost stream of consciousness.
that fragmentation directly mirrors their mental state, doesn't it? Makes the trauma feel visceral, not just something you read about.
Exactly. It's a powerful rhetorical move.
That juxtaposition, putting the huge official state violence right next to intimate personal pain, it just dramatically highlights how deep the rot goes.
It teaches you that the political is personal, intensely so.
And he keeps that atmosphere going with recurring symbols, doesn't he? Images.
Yes, specific imagery. Things that might seem ordinary take on this sinister weight.
Like the Austrian clock you mentioned in the outline.
Exactly that. Or the broken chair symbolizing decay, both physical and moral.
Even something like Dominican meringue music.
Right. Which sounds upbeat, cheerful.
Mm-hmm.
But Llosa shows how those lyrics, those songs, were co-opted as state propaganda. It underlines the regime's total grip, even on culture, on art.
Speaking of digging deep for insight and meaning, this deep dive, like all our work, aims to spark reflection and rational thought.
Which is very much the spirit of what you can find over at Mindful Moments. That's our YouTube channel.
Right, offering AI book analysis, summaries, critiques, really trying to encourage that kind of mindful engagement with ideas.
So let's use that reflective moment to pivot. Let's talk about the ethics here. This is advanced analysis territory.
Okay. A novel like this, dealing with real, horrific events, faces constraints, right? Historical reality, societal taboos.
Huge constraints. Llosa had to balance representing that brutality honestly with the ethical duties that come with fictionalizing real suffering.
Which brings us to the controversial scenes, particularly the sexual violence, which is so central to Urania's trauma.
It is.
So if the goal is rigor, empathy, does depicting that kind of violence risk becoming gratuitous, exploitative even?
That is the absolute critical ethical question here. And Llosa's defense, implicitly, is that its inclusion is necessary. It serves the larger purpose of showing the full scope of the regime's horror.
Meaning it wasn't random, but part of the system.
Exactly. The violence, especially sexual violence as a tool of power, wasn't isolated. It was tied directly to the mechanisms of control, degradation. To leave it out would be to sanitize history, to lessen the moral impact.
So the aim is empathy, forcing recognition of the true cost.
Yes, understanding, not titillation.
So it's more than a book about history. It's exploring the very act of remembering history, writing it down. Our sources mentioned its metafictional qualities.
Absolutely. The novel makes you question whose stories get told, whose get silenced, and why. Official history is often incomplete.
Llosa uses fiction to fill those gaps, the unspoken parts.
Precisely. He makes you think about how trauma shapes memory itself, making it fragmented, contested, unreliable even.
And that seems to be how he achieves his purpose. The layered structure, the psychological depth. He makes the trauma of this specific dictatorship in the Dominican Republic feel universal.
It becomes resonant. It's profoundly unsettling, and it challenges you, the reader, to think about complicity, survival, those tough truths.
It really is an incredible piece of contemporary historical fiction.
It is. Through that masterful narrative layering, the resonant imagery, the complex characters, The Feast of the Goat just completely succeeds in laying bare the personal and political wreckage of tyranny.
Its unflinching nature, its symbolism, it feels perfectly pitched for an audience willing to grapple with difficult history and ethics.
Definitely requires active engagement.
The book really stands as a cathartic piece, documenting but also transforming history for new readers, which leaves us with a final thought for you.
A provocative one.
How do we, as readers, maybe outside that specific national trauma, reconcile the need for unflinching historical truth with the ethics of fictionalizing profound human suffering to make a powerful story.
It's a tough balance.
Yeah.
One of the best historical novels always grapple with. It demands active, rational thought from us as readers.
Something to mull over. Okay, click the link on screen for the in-depth book summary. Please subscribe, share, maybe purchase the book via the link, and above all, think rationally.
And check out the many genre-based book podcasts over at Mindful Moments. Subscribe and nourish your mind on the go.